The signal came in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, which was somehow the most human part of the whole thing. Not during some grand ceremony, not at midnight when the sky felt heavy with meaning. Just a regular Tuesday, when half of Earth's population was eating lunch or stuck in traffic or arguing about something stupid online. A blinking light on a console in a monitoring station outside Geneva. A junior technician named Priya Mehta almost missed it because she was refilling her coffee. She didn't miss it. The message was not long. It was translated almost instantly by the AI systems that had been quietly improving for decades, cross-referencing patterns against thousands of intercepted deep space transmissions that most governments had never admitted to collecting. The translation came out clean, crisp, and absolutely devastating in its politeness. Attention, inhabitants of the third planet of the Sol system. You have been observed for a period of 412 of your orbital cycles. Your species has been assessed and categorized under Class 7 developmental status by the Grand Stellar Dominion Council, the governing authority of this galaxy. You are hereby informed that your planet and its surrounding orbital territories fall within Dominion-administered space. Further expansion beyond your current planetary boundary is not permitted without Council authorization. Compliance is expected. No response is necessary. No response is necessary. Those 4 words hit harder than anything else in the message. They weren't hostile. They weren't threatening. They were simply the words of something that had never once considered that a response might come. Earth, in the eyes of the Grand Stellar Dominion Council, was a minor footnote, a developing species on a small rock near an unremarkable star, in the unfashionable outer arm of a galaxy that the Council had been running for longer than humans had been walking upright. The message was shared between governments within 6 hours. Within 12, it had leaked. Within 24, the entire world knew. And the reaction was not fear, not panic, not the existential collapse that science fiction writers had always predicted. The reaction was, in a word, annoyance. A Brazilian senator was the first public official to go on record. She sat in front of a camera with the kind of expression a person gets when they've been told by a stranger that they're not allowed to use their own kitchen. No response is necessary, she repeated slowly. They sent us a notice. Like a parking ticket. They sent Earth a parking ticket. That line spread across the internet faster than anything in recorded history. Meanwhile, in the secured chambers where the actual decisions would be made, things were more complicated. Representatives from every major nation had gathered in Geneva. Scientists, military advisors, linguists, psychologists, and diplomats sat around tables that had been pulled together so fast that some of them didn't quite match. The lead xenolinguist, a quiet Kenyan man named Dr. Aching, had spent the last 18 hours going over every word of the message with the kind of focus usually reserved for diffusing bombs. His conclusion was uncomfortable. The message was not a threat in any traditional sense. It was a classification notice. Earth had been placed in a bureaucratic category, the way a wildlife preserve might be marked on a map. The Council had not asked anything of humanity. They had simply informed humanity of the rules that Earth had not agreed to, had not been consulted on, and had not even known existed until a Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Aching put it plainly during his briefing. They're not treating us as a threat. They're not treating us as an equal. They're treating us as a natural phenomenon, like a storm system that needs to be routed around. The room was very quiet after that. The question that every government kept circling back to was deceptively simple. Did humanity respond? And if so, what did it say? Some argued for silence. The message had said no response was necessary. Perhaps complying with that expectation was the wisest move. Learn more. Observe. Buy time. These were cautious voices, and there were many of them, and they made excellent points. Others argued for a formal acknowledgement. Something diplomatic, something careful, something that established Earth as a cooperative and intelligent species capable of following interstellar protocol. These voices were also reasonable. But there was a third group, smaller at first, that kept asking a different question entirely. Not how should we respond, but why are we accepting the premise? The premise that the Council had authority. The premise that Earth needed their permission to expand. The premise that a body no human had ever voted for, ever negotiated with, or ever even known existed, had the right to draw a line around the solar system and tell 8 billion people to stay inside it. That third group got louder as the days passed. What nobody outside the classified briefings knew yet was that Earth was not as far behind as the Council seemed to think. The 412 years of observation the Council had mentioned matched almost exactly with the period following humanity's first use of radio waves, which meant the Council had been watching Earth since the Victorian era and had made its assessment of human capability based on data that was, by interstellar standards, ancient. They had not updated their file. They had not looked closely since. In laboratories that officially didn't exist, in programs that had consumed quiet rivers of funding for decades, humanity had been doing what humanity always did when left alone long enough. Experimenting, failing, adapting, and occasionally achieving something that shouldn't have been possible yet. Gravity manipulation research had yielded results that were kept off every public database. Propulsion systems using principles that physicists debated in hushed tones had reached prototype stages. And a small, crude vessel, designated Project Outrider, never officially acknowledged, had been sitting in a lunar hangar for 3 years, fully functional, waiting for a reason to launch. The Council had sent a notice. Earth had just found its reason. The decision, when it finally came, was not made by a single government or a single leader. It was the product of an emergency session of every major space agency, every relevant scientific body, and representatives of every inhabited continent. It took 11 days of argument, of leaked drafts, of public pressure, of quiet back-channel conversations between people who had spent their careers dreaming of exactly this moment. The final vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Earth would respond, not with compliance, not with a request for authorization, not with the careful, hedging language of a species that had accepted its place on the galactic map. Earth would respond the way Earth had always responded to being told what it could not do. Priya Mehta, the technician who had found the signal, was asked in a later interview what she had thought when she first read the translation. She thought for a moment, then smiled. I thought, well, they don't know us very well, do they? She was right. They didn't. The message that Earth sent back was composed over those 11 days by a team of 200 linguists, scientists, diplomats, and historians. It was transmitted on every frequency the Council's message had used, plus 17 others, at maximum power, repeated on a rolling cycle so it could not be missed or dismissed. It was not long either, but unlike the Council's message, it ended with a question. And that question was the first shot in a conflict that no one in the Grand Stellar Dominion Council had seen coming. Because in 412 years of watching, they had never once seen a Class 7 species talk back. The Council chamber on Varith Prime was not built for surprise. It had stood for 9,000 years, its architecture designed to project permanence and authority. High vaulted ceilings made from compressed starstone, walls inlaid with the seals of 417 member civilizations, a floor so polished it reflected the slow rotation of the galaxy's core projected above in real time. Nothing in this room was accidental. Everything was a reminder that the Grand Stellar Dominion Council had existed long before any individual species in the chamber had developed the ability to look up at the stars and wonder what was there. High Arbiter Solon Veth had presided over 11,000 council sessions. She had managed border disputes between civilizations that spanned multiple star systems. She had overseen the absorption of 9 developing species into the Dominion's administrative framework. She had never, in 11,000 sessions, been handed a document and told that a Class 7 species had sent a reply. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Earth's response began with a formal acknowledgement of the Council's message, written in the Council's own diplomatic syntax. Correctly, almost perfectly, with only minor grammatical variances that the translation team had flagged as likely intentional. This was, in itself, astonishing. Class 7 species did not possess interstellar communication protocols. They did not know the syntax. Earth had reverse-engineered it from a single received transmission in 11 days. The message then, with careful and precise language, raised 17 separate legal objections to the Council's classification notice. 17. Solon Veth's senior advisor, a tall, gray-skinned Myrati named Cess, stood beside her and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "They cited the Haven Accords." "I see that," Solon said. "The Haven Accords were written 6,000 years ago." "I can read," Cess. "They cited subsection 14, clause 3. The provision that states that no territorial boundary may be imposed upon a sentient species without representation, consent, or demonstrated incapacity for self-governance. Sess paused. How did they know about subsection 14, clause 3? That was the question. The Haven Accords were not secret, but they were obscure, administrative law buried in millennia of galactic precedent. They had been cited perhaps a dozen times in the Council's entire history, always by established member civilizations with legal teams that had spent centuries studying Dominion law. A Class 7 species should not have known they existed. What the Council did not know, what they could not have known, because they had stopped watching closely 400 years ago, was that humanity had not been idle. The intercepted transmissions that governments had spent decades quietly collecting included, buried in the background noise of interstellar communication, fragments of Council administrative traffic. Nothing classified, nothing military, but procedural data, governance signals, the low-frequency bureaucratic hum of an organization that had been running the galaxy so long it had stopped worrying about who might be listening. Human cryptographers and linguists had spent 30 years working on those fragments. The Haven Accords had been partially reconstructed from 17 separate intercepted references. The legal team Earth assembled had not started from nothing. They had started from 30 years of quiet, patient, utterly secret homework. The 17th objection in Earth's message was the one that caused the chamber to fall completely silent when Solon read it aloud. It stated that Earth did not recognize the Council's classification system as legitimate authority over sovereign worlds, that the concept of developmental status as a basis for restricting a species' movement through space was inconsistent with the foundational principles the Council itself claimed to operate under, and that Earth was formally requesting, not asking, requesting, a seat at the Council table to present its case in full, not requesting membership, not requesting a hearing before a subcommittee, requesting a seat at the table where the actual decisions were made. The chamber erupted. 417 civilizations, or rather their representatives, all talking at once. Some were furious. Some were amused. Several were deeply uncomfortable in a way they couldn't immediately explain. A Dulhuri representative in the far corner was quietly running the legal citations Earth had provided through his own legal database and looking increasingly pale. Solon Veth called for silence 3 times before she got it. The request, she said carefully, is without precedent. Everything about this is without precedent, Sess said quietly, just for her. She knew he was right. The protocol for dealing with a non-compliant Class 7 species was simple because it had never needed to be complicated. Wait. Species at Earth's developmental level either destroyed themselves before becoming a problem, or they grew slowly enough that by the time they were capable of interstellar presence, decades of observation and managed contact had shaped them into something the Council could work with. There was no protocol for a species that received a bureaucratic notice and responded with a legal brief 11 days later. The Council's response, when it came, was a masterpiece of institutional defensiveness. It acknowledged Earth's message, which it was legally required to do, given the Haven Accord citation, and informed Earth that its request was under review. It offered no timeline. It imposed no penalty for the message. It did nothing at all, really, except buy time. Earth had expected this. Project Outrider launched from its lunar hangar on a Wednesday morning. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, every government on Earth knew it was going, and a significant portion of the planet watched a live feed on screens of every size as the vessel, sleek, human-built, smaller than most people expected, lit its drives and headed outward. Not toward Council space. Not toward any inhabited system. Outrider's course took it to a point 17 light minutes beyond the orbit of Neptune, where it conducted a series of navigational tests, turned around, and came home. The trip took 4 days. It was not a military act. It was not a provocation, technically. It was simply a Class 7 species, classified as restricted from expansion beyond their planetary boundary, very calmly going for a drive in the solar system. The Council's monitoring systems flagged it immediately. 3 separate Dominion administrative stations sent reports. An emergency subcommittee was convened. Arguments were had. Legal teams were consulted on whether Outrider's voyage technically violated the boundary notice, given that Neptune's orbit was still within the Sol system, and the notice had specified planetary boundary, not system boundary. and was therefore possibly, not in breach. The legal teams argued about it for 6 weeks. Earth launched Outrider 2 more times while they argued. On the third launch, Outrider went further. It crossed the heliopause, the boundary of the solar system itself, traveled for 11 hours, and returned. It planted nothing, claimed nothing, transmitted nothing. It simply went outside the line and came back. In the council chamber, Cess placed a data chip on Solon Veth's desk without a word. She looked at the trajectory report. She looked at Cess. She looked back at the report. "They're not going to stop," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Cess agreed. "And look at the drive readings from the third voyage. We've been comparing them to our records of Earth's technology 400 years ago, and to our projections of where they should be now." He paused. "There is a significant discrepancy." Solon Veth, who had presided over 11,000 sessions without being surprised, leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a very long time. "How significant?" she finally asked. Cess pulled up a comparison. The numbers sat on the display between them, stark and impossible and completely real. Earth should not have been able to build Outrider. Not yet. Not for another 300 years, by the Council's models. And yet there it was, crossing the heliopause on a Wednesday, recorded by 17 independent monitoring stations, undeniable. The Council had been watching Earth for 400 years. They had simply not been paying attention. "Convene a full session," Solon said quietly. "Not a subcommittee. Everyone." "On what grounds?" She set down the report. "On the grounds that we may have made a very serious miscalculation." The full session of the Grand Stellar Dominion Council had been called only 19 times in its 9,000-year history. Wars, extinctions, the collapse of entire stellar civilizations. These were the things that warranted full sessions. The chamber on Vareth Prime had been designed to hold all 417 member representatives simultaneously, but it had never been used at full capacity except during the 7 Great Crises. The seats in the upper tiers had collected a fine layer of dust. They were clean now. Representatives arrived over the course of 3 days. Some came from nearby systems, barely hours away by faster-than-light transit. Others came from the far edges of Dominion space, their journeys measured in weeks. The Dulharis sent their entire senior delegation. The Myrati came in formal war remembrance robes, which was technically a diplomatic statement about the seriousness of the occasion and not a threat, though several younger civilizations in the chamber weren't sure they understood the distinction. Even the Vorith, reclusive and rarely present in person, sent a physical representative, a spindly, nearly transparent being who sat in the upper tier and said nothing, but whose presence alone told Solon Veth everything she needed to know about how the galaxy was reading this situation. Everyone was afraid. Not of Earth exactly, of what Earth represented. The presentation that Solon's technical team delivered was precise and deeply uncomfortable. It laid out, in exhaustive detail, the gap between what Earth should have been capable of and what Earth had demonstrably done. The drive signatures from Outrider's 3 voyages were analyzed against every known propulsion model. The legal team's reconstruction of the Haven Accords was dissected, not to dispute it, because it was accurate, but to understand how it had been done. A full historical audit of Earth's observable technological development was presented, and the moment it reached the period roughly 50 years prior to the Council's notice, the graph stopped matching the projection model. Quietly, steadily, invisibly, Earth had accelerated. A senior Myrati official named Prethkos spoke first after the presentation ended. His voice carried the kind of measured weight that came from representing a civilization that had been a council member for 4,000 years. "The question I want answered," he said, "is not how. The question is why we did not notice." The answer, when it came from the technical team, was honest and humbling. The monitoring system used for Class 7 species was automated. It was designed to flag significant changes, nuclear weapon use, large-scale ecological collapse, first radio signals, first orbital launches. It was not designed to notice the slow, deliberate accumulation of capability by a species that had apparently decided to conduct its most important research in ways that didn't trigger any of the monitoring flags. Earth had not hidden its progress. It had simply progressed in areas the monitoring system wasn't watching. "They built quietly," Prethkos said. "Apparently so," Solon confirmed. "That is not a Class 7 behavior pattern." "No," she agreed. "It is not. The second uncomfortable truth arrived in the form of a follow-up transmission from Earth, which had been received 2 days before the full session began and which Solon had deliberately held until now. She displayed it for the chamber without preamble. It was short. It acknowledged that the council had convened a full session, which Earth had no official way of knowing about, which meant Earth had its own monitoring capabilities and had been watching council administrative traffic, and it reiterated Earth's request for a seat at the table. But it included something new, a technical appendix. The appendix contained detailed specifications for a propulsion system that was, by any measure the council's engineers could apply, roughly 2 generations beyond what the Dominion's own vessels currently used. It was not a threat. There was no threatening language anywhere in the message. The appendix was presented simply as supporting documentation for Earth's claim that it qualified, under the Haven Accord's own criteria, for reclassification. Sess, standing at Solon's shoulder, said very quietly, "They built something we haven't built yet." The chamber had broken into competing conversations. Solon let it run for a full minute before calling order. When the noise died, she looked out at 417 civilizations, each of them processing what they'd just seen, each of them doing the same mental calculation, each of them arriving at the same uncomfortable place. Earth had received a bureaucratic notice telling it to stay home. Earth had responded with a legal brief. Earth had then gone for a drive outside the solar system 3 times. And now Earth had casually attached, to a diplomatic message, technical specifications for technology that made the Dominion's flagship vessels look like they were running on outdated components. What they had thought was a parking ticket situation had become something else entirely. The debate that followed was the longest in the chamber's recorded history, not in total hours, but in the sheer density of argument. Some representatives pushed for a show of force, a Dominion fleet positioned at the Sol system's edge, a clear signal that Earth's casual rule-bending had limits. These voices were louder at the beginning of the debate and quieter by the end, as the technical team's estimates of Earth's defensive capabilities were quietly circulated and quietly absorbed. No one wanted to be the civilization that started a war with a species that had apparently been building military hardware in their basement for 50 years. Others argued for reclassification. Earth had arguably demonstrated the criteria for advancement. Bring them into the system. Give them a seat, perhaps not at the main table, but a seat. A probationary status. Something that moved the situation from confrontation toward absorption. But it was a Dulhuri elder named Vashit who said the thing that stopped the debate cold. "We are discussing," Vashit said, "how to manage a situation. We are treating this as a problem to be contained or resolved. I think we have misread what is happening." Earth did not respond to our notice with fear or compliance or aggression. They responded with legal scholarship and navigational demonstrations and engineering schematics. That is not how a species behaves when it feels threatened. That is how a species behaves when it is not threatened, when it knows something we do not. The chamber was quiet. "We have been administering this galaxy for 9,000 years, Vashit continued. "We have added 417 members to this body. All of them came to us uncertain, grateful, eager to learn. We are the largest, oldest, most powerful governing structure in known space. And Earth, a Class 7 world that has had radio technology for 400 years, sent us a message that essentially said, 'We know your rules better than you thought we did. We have been outside your lines already, and here is something we built that you have not.' And then they asked to sit at our table." She paused. "I do not think they are asking. I think they are informing us." No one spoke for a long time. Solon Veth, who had managed 11,000 sessions, who had never been afraid of a single one, felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt uncertain. She looked at the technical appendix still displayed above the chamber. She thought about Outrider crossing the heliopause on a Wednesday. She thought about the legal team that had reconstructed the Haven Accords from fragments. She thought about a technician with a coffee cup who had found a signal on a Tuesday afternoon and set all of this in motion. She thought about what the Council had always assumed about developing species, that they needed guidance, management, patient administration from above, that the galaxy was best governed by those who had been doing it longest. She thought about the fact that Earth had apparently spent 4 centuries watching the Council the same way the Council had been watching Earth, and had prepared accordingly, and had said nothing until they were ready. "We will send a formal response," she said finally. The chamber waited. We will acknowledge Earth's request for reclassification. We will schedule a formal review. And we will send an envoy. She looked around the room. A listening envoy. Not to speak. To listen. Seth leaned down. And if Earth has already surpassed us in more areas than just propulsion? Solon looked back at the display. Then we are going to have a very interesting conversation, she said. The Dominion envoy arrived at the edge of the Sol system on a quiet morning in October. The vessel was large by most standards. A diplomatic carrier called the Unwavering Accord, 3 kilometers long, crewed by a mixed delegation of Myrati, Dulhuri, and Vorith representatives, along with a full complement of translators and legal advisors and cultural analysts who had spent the 2-month transit cramming everything the Council's archives contained about Earth's history. They had read about the wars, the recoveries, the collapses, and the rebuildings. They had studied the art and the philosophy and the science. They had prepared themselves, thoroughly and professionally, to encounter a civilization that was impressive for its developmental stage. They were not prepared for what was waiting for them. At the designated meeting point, 17 vessels were already in formation. Not 1, 17. They were not identical. They varied in size and configuration in ways that suggested they had been built by different teams with different design philosophies, all operating under a common framework that held the differences together. The smallest was roughly the size of the Unwavering Accord. The largest was something the Envoy's engineers spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to correctly estimate before arriving at a figure that they triple-checked because it seemed wrong, and then checked again because it was not wrong. The lead Myrati diplomat, a cool and experienced woman named Rethsal, stood on the observation deck looking at the formation and said nothing for almost 2 minutes. Her aide eventually asked if she was all right. "I'm recalibrating," she said. The communication that came from the Earth formation was warm, professional, and entirely in the Council's formal diplomatic syntax. Not almost perfectly, as the first message had been, but exactly perfectly, without a single grammatical variance. The voice that transmitted it belonged to a human man who introduced himself as Director Amaru Calisea of Earth's Joint Interstellar Authority, and he welcomed the envoy to the Sol system with a courtesy that somehow managed to be completely genuine while also making it gently clear that Earth was hosting this meeting, not receiving an inspection. The Unwavering Accord was guided to a docking position alongside a station that hadn't appeared in any of the monitoring data. It was large, beautifully constructed, and looked as though it had been operational for years. Rethsal asked how old the station was. The answer came back: for years. Built in parallel with the Outrider program. Earth had been building a diplomatic reception facility before anyone had known there would be anything to receive. That detail, more than the ships, more than the technology, was what finally made Rethsal understand what she was dealing with. Inside the station, in a meeting room that was neither ostentatiously grand nor conspicuously humble, Rethsal met Director Calisea in person for the first time. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with gray at his temples and the particular kind of stillness that belonged to people who had spent long careers navigating difficult situations. He shook her hand, a human gesture she had studied and executed correctly, and gestured for her to sit. He had brought 6 people. She had brought 11. He didn't seem to notice the imbalance. "We appreciate the Council sending a formal delegation," Calisea said. "We understand this is an unusual situation. It is unprecedented," Rethsal said carefully. "For you, perhaps." He said it without sharpness, simply as a statement. "For us, it's been about 14 months of very concentrated work. 14 months. From first contact to this room, to 17 ships and a functioning station and a legal team that had dismantled the Council's notification on 17 separate grounds. 14 months. The talks lasted 9 days. Rethsal had been instructed to listen, and she did. What she heard reshaped every assumption she had carried into the Sol system. Earth had not developed in isolation. It had developed in full awareness that it was being watched, not because it had known about the Council specifically, but because the mathematics of a universe this old made it essentially certain that someone was out there, and whoever that someone was, they were probably watching. This assumption had quietly shaped Earth's long-term planning for generations, not as a source of fear, but as a variable. They had planned for contact the way an engineer plans for load-bearing stress, not certain when it would come, but certain it would come, and building accordingly. The propulsion technology in the appendix was real and functional. Earth offered to share the underlying theory freely, with no conditions attached. Rethsal's engineers reviewed it over 2 days and returned looking slightly dazed. The theory was not only valid, it opened pathways that the Council's physicists had considered closed for 3,000 years. On the 5th day, Calisea presented Earth's formal reclassification petition. It was not aggressive. It did not demand. It laid out, in precise and documented detail, every criterion the Haven Accords defined for autonomous interstellar status and demonstrated, with evidence, with recordings, with technical specifications, that Earth met each one. Then it noted, politely and without any particular emphasis, that Earth intended to continue its program of interstellar exploration regardless of the Council's decision, that this program would be conducted peacefully and in accordance with the principles Earth considered reasonable, and that Earth hoped very much to do this as a recognized partner within the Dominion framework rather than outside it. Rethsal understood exactly what was being said. Earth was not threatening. Earth was not posturing. Earth was simply being honest. The classification notice had not stopped them and would not stop them, but they genuinely preferred a cooperative relationship, and they were extending that offer sincerely. The alternative, a species with Earth's capabilities operating in Dominion space with no formal relationship and no agreements, was not a comfortable thing to contemplate. On the 8th day, Rethsal transmitted a full report to Verith Prime. She did not summarize or editorialize. She transmitted everything, unfiltered, with one line added at the end in her own words. It said, "Recommend immediate reclassification and formal membership discussions. The alternative is not available." The Council's response came back within hours, which was unprecedented. Full sessions took weeks to convene, but this answer didn't need a full session. Sol and Veth had clearly been waiting. The response authorized Rethsal to open formal membership discussions on the Council's behalf. On the 9th and final day, Director Calisea and Rethsal signed a preliminary framework agreement that established Earth as a provisional member of the Grand Stellar Dominion Council, with full membership to be confirmed after a formal review process that both parties agreed to complete within 2 years. After the signing, as the delegations were preparing to part, Rethsal asked Calisea something that had been sitting in the back of her mind since she'd arrived. She asked it quietly, just to him, off the record. "When you read the Council's original notice," she said, "the one that said no response was necessary, what did you think?" Calisea considered the question for a moment. There was a long window behind him that looked out at the Earth formation. All 17 ships still in formation, quiet and patient against the black. "I thought about every time someone told my grandmother she wasn't allowed somewhere," he said. "She was a small woman. Very polite. She always said thank you, very much, and then she went anyway." He looked back at Rethsal. "It's something of a family tradition." Rethsal looked at him for a moment. Then she did something that her cultural briefings had described, but that she had never done before in her diplomatic career. She laughed. On the transit back to Verith Prime, she drafted her personal report separately from the official one. It was not a document that would enter the public record. It was a private assessment, the kind that senior diplomats wrote for their own understanding of events. She wrote, "The Council has governed this galaxy for 9,000 years on the assumption that age confers wisdom and size confers authority. Both things are sometimes true. But we have spent 9,000 years watching developing species with the eyes of administrators, not equals. We have never before encountered a species that watched us back with equal patience and more imagination. Earth does not think of the galaxy the way our members do. They think of it the way they think of a new neighborhood. Something to explore, something to understand, something to eventually belong to. Not by permission, by nature." She paused, and then wrote the last line. "We did not discover Earth. Earth was waiting for us to notice it was ready." Back in Geneva, Priya Mehta was at her console again. Different Tuesday, same coffee. The monitoring station had been upgraded significantly since the signal 14 months ago. Better equipment, more staff, a direct line to the Joint Interstellar Authority that hadn't existed before. She was no longer a junior technician. She had a title now, though she found it slightly embarrassing to say out loud. She was watching the feed from the Sol system's outer edge. The unwavering Accord was departing. The 17 Earth vessels held their formation until the Council ship had cleared the heliopause. then peeled off one by one toward their home trajectories. One of her colleagues leaned over and asked what she was thinking. She watched the last ship's drive signature fade from the display. She picked up her coffee. "I'm thinking," she said, "that we should probably start building more."